He said he was saving me. Those were his exact words the night I moved into his house, clutching the only suitcase I had left from my parents' belongings. "I'm saving you," he whispered, his hand resting on my shoulder just a little too long. But every night, every single night after that, I could hear his footsteps, slow, deliberate, certain, coming toward my door. And I knew what was about to happen again. My heart would pound so hard I thought it might break through my chest. My hands would go numb, and I'd lie there, frozen, praying that maybe tonight he'd just walk past. But he never did. This is Ava's story. A young woman who thought her uncle was her protector, her last remaining family, her safe place in a world that had already taken everything from her. Until the truth, the horrifying, soul-crushing truth, tore her world apart all over again. And this time, the monster wasn't a stranger. It was the man everyone called a hero. Before we begin, if you believe every survivor deserves to be heard, if you believe that silence protects the abuser and never the victim, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it, because you might help someone find the courage to speak up. You might save a life, and that life could be someone you know, someone you love, or even your own. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Ava Thompson was 21 years old when her world collapsed. Not once, but twice. The first time was on a rainy Tuesday evening in March, when a police officer knocked on her apartment door and told her that her parents, David and Karen Thompson, had been killed in a head-on collision on Interstate 95. A drunk driver, wrong side of the road. They died instantly, the officer said, as if that detail was supposed to bring comfort, as if knowing they didn't suffer would somehow make the suffocating grief any easier to bear. Ava had no siblings, no grandparents still living. Her father had been an only child, and her mother had one brother, Samuel Mitchell, who lived 3 states away in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ohio. Ava had only met Uncle Samuel a handful of times growing up, mostly at holiday gatherings and family reunions. He was the kind of man who seemed gentle, soft-spoken, always quick with a smile, and a $20 bill slipped into her hand when her parents weren't looking. "Buy yourself something nice," he'd say with a wink. She remembered thinking he was kind, generous, safe. 2 weeks after the funeral, after Ava had spent 14 days wandering her parents' empty house like a ghost, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but cry, until her body had no tears left, Uncle Samuel called. His voice was warm, concerned, almost fatherly. "Ava, sweetheart, you can't stay there alone," he said. "Come stay with me. You're family. You're all I have left of your mother, and I can't lose you too." She could hear the emotion in his voice, the way it cracked on the last word, and something inside her broke all over again. Here was someone who cared, someone who wanted her, someone who wouldn't let her drown in this unbearable loneliness. The community praised Samuel when word got around that he'd taken in his niece. "What a good man," the neighbors said. "Not many people would do that," her mother's old friends whispered at the grocery store. "He's a saint," someone wrote in a Facebook post that got 200 likes. And Ava wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found safety. That even though her parents were gone, she still had someone who would protect her, care for her, love her the way family was supposed to. She packed her life into 3 suitcases and a duffel bag. She said goodbye to her childhood home, to the kitchen where her mother had taught her to bake cookies, to the living room where her father had fallen asleep watching football every Sunday. She locked the door for the last time, got into Uncle Samuel's car, and drove 300 miles to what she thought would be her new beginning. But it wasn't a beginning. It was the start of a nightmare that would steal 5 years of her life and nearly destroy everything she had left of herself. The first few weeks were almost normal. Uncle Samuel's house was a modest two-story home in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where kids rode bikes on the sidewalks and people waved to each other from their front porches. Ava's room was on the second floor, painted a soft lavender color, with clean white curtains and a bed that smelled like fresh laundry detergent. "I fixed it up for you," Samuel said proudly, standing in the doorway as Ava set down her suitcases. "I want you to feel at home here. This is your home now." And for a moment, just a fleeting, fragile moment, Ava felt something other than grief. She felt gratitude. Samuel cooked dinner every night: chicken parmesan on Mondays, pot roast on Wednesdays, spaghetti and meatballs on Fridays. He'd sit across from her at the small kitchen table asking about her day, listening as she talked about the part-time job she'd gotten at a local bookstore, nodding thoughtfully when she mentioned maybe enrolling in community college classes. "You're so smart, Ava," he'd say, reaching across to pat her hand. "Your mother would be so proud of you." And every time he said it, Ava's throat would tighten, tears threatening to spill, because she missed her mother so much it physically hurt. And hearing someone speak about her like she'd mattered, like she was still somehow present, made the pain just a little more bearable. But slowly, so slowly that Ava didn't notice it happening, things began to change. Samuel started paying attention to what she wore. "That skirt's a little short, don't you think?" he'd say, his eyes lingering on her legs just a second too long. "You don't want people getting the wrong idea." Ava would feel heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassed, and she'd go back upstairs to change into jeans, even though it was 90 degrees outside. He began asking questions about her co-workers at the bookstore. "Who's James? You've mentioned him 3 times this week. Are you interested in him?" The way he asked made Ava's stomach twist uncomfortably. "He's just a friend," she'd say quickly. "Just someone I work with." But Samuel's jaw would tighten, his smile fading, and he'd go quiet in a way that made the air in the room feel heavy and wrong. He started checking her phone, not openly at first. He'd ask to see a funny video she'd mentioned, and then his thumb would scroll just a little too far, his eyes scanning her messages. "Who's Emily texting you about going to the movies? I don't think that's a good idea, Ava. You just got here. You need time to settle in, to heal. Going out with people you barely know. It's not safe." Ava wanted to argue, wanted to say that Emily was nice, that she'd been kind to her at work, that she needed friends, needed some kind of normal life. But the look in Samuel's eyes stopped her. It was a look that said he knew better, that he was only trying to protect her, that she should be grateful he cared enough to worry. The isolation happened so gradually that Ava didn't realize she was being cut off from the world until it was already done. She stopped going out after work, stopped answering texts from coworkers, stopped talking about enrolling in classes. Samuel was always there, always hovering, always with some reason why whatever she wanted to do wasn't a good idea. It happened on a Thursday night in October, 3 months after Ava had moved in. She'd had a bad day at work. A customer had yelled at her over a book order that wasn't her fault, and she'd spent her entire shift fighting back tears, feeling overwhelmed and exhausted and so desperately homesick for her parents that she thought she might collapse under the weight of it. She came home, went straight to her room, and lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember what her mother's voice sounded like, terrified that she was starting to forget. Samuel knocked on her door around 9 o'clock. "Ava? Sweetheart, are you okay? You didn't come down for dinner." His voice was soft, concerned. Ava sat up, wiping her eyes. "I'm fine," she called out, but her voice betrayed her, cracking on the last word. She heard the door open. "You don't sound fine," Samuel said, stepping into the room. He closed the door behind him. That should have been Ava's first warning. But she was too tired, too sad, too lost in her own grief to notice. "Talk to me," he said, sitting down on the edge of her bed. "What's wrong?" Ava told him about the customer, about how small and worthless it had made her feel, about how everything reminded her of her parents, and she didn't know how to keep living in a world where they didn't exist. Samuel listened, nodding, his hand resting on her knee. "You've been through so much," he said quietly. "More than anyone your age should have to endure. But you're not alone, Ava. You have me. I'm here for you. I'll always be here for you." His hand moved higher, just slightly, just enough that Ava's body went rigid. She told herself she was imagining it, that he was just being comforting, that she was being paranoid. But then his hand moved again, and this time there was no mistaking it. "Uncle Samuel," Ava whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you?" He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Shh," he said softly. "It's okay. I'm just trying to make you feel better. You're so tense, so stressed. Let me help you." Ava's mind was screaming at her to move, to push him away, to run, but her body wouldn't respond. She was frozen, trapped in a nightmare that didn't make sense, because this was her uncle, her mother's brother, the man who was supposed to keep her safe. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. But it was real. And it was happening. And when it was over, when Samuel finally stood up, smoothed down his shirt, and smiled at her like nothing had happened, like he'd just finished helping her with her homework or fixing a leaky faucet, Ava felt something inside her shatter. "Get some sleep," he said, his voice casual, almost cheerful. "You'll feel better in the morning." He walked out, closing the door gently behind him, and Ava sat there, trembling, her mind spinning, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how the person who was supposed to protect her had just become the person she needed protection from. She didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt his hands on her, heard his voice in her ear. She wanted to scream, wanted to cry, wanted to call someone, anyone, and beg for help. But who would she call? She had no family, no close friends, no one who would believe her if she said that Samuel Mitchell, the man everyone praised for his kindness, the man who'd taken her in when she had nowhere else to go, had just violated her in the most unthinkable way. And even if someone did believe her, where would she go? She had no money, no place to live, no support system. She was completely, utterly alone. So she stayed quiet. She told herself it was a one-time thing, that maybe she'd misunderstood, that maybe it wouldn't happen again. She told herself she could handle it, that she'd be more careful, that she'd lock her door at night and avoid being alone with him. She told herself every lie she needed to believe to survive the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Because the truth, the horrible, soul-crushing truth that she wasn't ready to face yet, was that this was only the beginning. Most victims of sexual abuse stay silent, especially when the abuser is a family member or someone in a position of trust. The shame is overwhelming, the fear is paralyzing, and the confusion, the desperate need to believe that the person who's hurting you still loves you, still cares about you, still has your best interests at heart, can keep you trapped for years. Ava didn't report what happened that night. She didn't tell anyone. She locked it away in a corner of her mind and tried to pretend it hadn't happened at all. But trauma doesn't disappear just because you refuse to acknowledge it. It festers, it grows, it poisons everything it touches. And Ava's nightmare was only just beginning. It happened again 2 weeks later, and then again the week after that, and then it became a routine, a horrifying, inescapable pattern that Ava couldn't break no matter how hard she tried. Samuel would find reasons to be alone with her. He'd come to her room late at night, claiming he'd heard her crying, claiming he just wanted to check on her. He'd catch her in the hallway when she was coming out of the shower, his eyes traveling over her body in a way that made her skin crawl. He'd insist on driving her to work, his hand resting on her thigh the entire way, squeezing just hard enough to remind her that she had no power, no control, no escape. The worst part wasn't even the abuse itself, as horrifying as that was. The worst part was the way Samuel acted like everything was normal. He'd sit across from her at breakfast, smiling, asking about her plans for the day, complimenting her on her hair, her outfit, her smile. He'd introduce her to neighbors as my niece, the light of my life. his arm wrapped around her shoulders, his grip just tight enough to keep her from pulling away. He'd post pictures of them together on social media, father-daughter outings to the park, to restaurants, to the movies, with captions like, "So grateful for family," and "Blessed to have this wonderful young woman in my life." And people would comment, would like, would praise him for being such a good man, such a caring uncle, such an example of what family should be. And Ava would read those comments and feel like she was losing her mind. Because how could no one see the truth? How could no one look at her and see the emptiness in her eyes, the way her smile never quite reached her face, the way she flinched every time someone touched her? How could they look at Samuel and see a hero when she saw a monster? It made her feel crazy. It made her feel like maybe she was the problem, like maybe she was broken, damaged, wrong in some fundamental way that made this her fault. Samuel made sure she knew she had nowhere to go. "You're lucky I took you in," he'd say, his tone casual but his eyes cold. "No one else wanted you, Ava. You know that, right? You have no money, no job that pays enough to support yourself, no friends, no family. If you left here, where would you go? A homeless shelter? The streets? Is that what you want?" And Ava, exhausted, terrified, beaten down by months of abuse and manipulation, would shake her head. "No," she'd whisper. "I don't want that." And Samuel would smile, satisfied, and pat her cheek like she was a child who'd just learned an important lesson. Ava's mental health deteriorated rapidly. She stopped eating, her already slim frame becoming skeletal, her clothes hanging off her body like they belonged to someone else. She stopped sleeping, surviving on 2 or 3 hours a night, her eyes ringed with dark circles, her face pale and drawn. She stopped caring about anything, her shifts at the bookstore becoming mechanical, going through the motions, smiling when she was supposed to smile, speaking when she was supposed to speak, but feeling nothing. Absolutely nothing, because feeling meant acknowledging what was happening to her, and acknowledging it meant accepting that she was trapped in a living nightmare with no way out. Every time Samuel said he loved her, every time he called her his special girl, every time he told her how much he cared about her, Ava wanted to disappear. She wanted to cease to exist, to become invisible, to escape into nothingness where his hands couldn't reach her, where his voice couldn't find her, where the crushing weight of shame and fear and helplessness couldn't suffocate her anymore. She thought about ending her life, more than once. She stood in the bathroom staring at bottles of pills, wondering how many it would take. She stood at the top of the stairs, imagining what it would feel like to fall, to let gravity take over, to finally be free from this unbearable existence. But something stopped her. Some small, stubborn part of her that refused to let him win, some tiny ember of the person she used to be, the girl who'd had dreams and plans, and a future that looked bright and full of possibility. That part of her whispered that this wasn't her fault, that she didn't deserve this, that somewhere, somehow, there had to be a way out. And that part of her, as small and fragile as it was, kept her alive. Barely, but alive. Abusers thrive on control and isolation. They cut you off from anyone who might help you, anyone who might tell you that what's happening isn't normal, isn't okay, isn't your fault. They make you believe that you're alone, that no one would believe you, that leaving would be worse than staying. They erode your sense of self until you can't remember who you were before them, until you start to believe that maybe you are the problem, maybe you did something to deserve this, maybe this is just your life now and you should accept it. That's exactly what Samuel did to Ava, and for a long time it worked. Ava started writing in a journal 6 months into living with Samuel. She didn't plan to. She'd found an old notebook in a drawer in her room, its pages yellowed and blank, and one night, when the silence felt like it was crushing her chest, when the weight of everything she was carrying felt too heavy to bear alone, she picked up a pen and started writing. She wrote about her parents, about how much she missed them, about the sound of her father's laugh and the way her mother smelled like vanilla and cinnamon. She wrote about the girl she used to be, the one who'd believed in good things, who'd trusted people, who'd thought the world was mostly safe. And then, slowly, carefully, she started writing about what was happening to her. She couldn't say the words out loud, couldn't bring herself to speak them into existence, but she could write them. She could put them on paper, concrete and undeniable, proof that this was real, that she wasn't crazy, that what Samuel was doing to her was wrong. She wrote about the first time it happened, about the pattern that had emerged, about the things he said, the way he touched her, the way he made her feel like she was nothing, less than nothing, just an object for him to use whenever he wanted. The journal became her lifeline, her only safe space, the only place where she could be honest about what was happening, where she could acknowledge the truth without fear of being dismissed or blamed or punished. She hid it under her mattress, terrified that Samuel would find it, terrified of what he might do if he read the words she'd written. But she kept writing anyway, because writing meant she still existed. It meant some part of her was still fighting, still refusing to disappear completely. One Saturday in late spring, Emily from the bookstore stopped by the house. Ava had mentioned in passing months ago where she lived, and Emily, worried because Ava had been calling in sick more and more frequently, had decided to check on her. Samuel answered the door, all smiles and charm. "Emily, right? Ava's mentioned you. Please, come in." He called up the stairs. "Ava, sweetheart, you have a visitor." Ava came down, her heart pounding, terrified of what might happen, of what Samuel might say or do with Emily there. But he was the perfect host, offered tea, made small talk, and then, after 15 minutes, announced he had errands to run and left them alone. Emily stared at Ava for a long moment after Samuel's car pulled out of the driveway. "Ava," she said softly, "are you okay? And please, please don't just say yes, because I can see that you're not." Ava's throat tightened. She wanted to lie, wanted to say she was fine, wanted to protect herself from the vulnerability of admitting the truth. But something in Emily's eyes, something genuine and concerned and kind, broke through the walls she'd built. "No," Ava whispered, and it was the first honest word she'd spoken in months. "No, I'm not okay. I'm not okay at all." She didn't tell Emily everything that day. She couldn't. The words were too heavy, too shameful, too terrifying. But she told her enough. Enough for Emily to understand that Ava was in trouble. Enough for Emily to reach across the table, take Ava's hand and say, "You don't have to stay here. I don't know what's happening, but I can see that you're scared. And whatever it is, you don't deserve it. Do you understand me? You don't deserve it." And for the first time in months, Ava felt a flicker of something other than despair. She felt hope. Tiny, fragile, barely there, but real. And that hope became the crack in the foundation of Samuel's control. Before we continue, we want to pause here and ask you something. If you or someone you know is in a situation like Ava's, please, don't keep silent. Reach out to a trusted person, a counselor, a helpline in your country. Organizations exist specifically to help people escape abusive situations. Your voice matters. Your life matters. And you deserve to be safe. Please remember that. Now, how do you feel about Ava's situation so far? Can you imagine the fear she must have been feeling? Can you imagine what it's like to be trapped in your own home, terrified of the person who's supposed to protect you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. It took Ava 3 more weeks to work up the courage to tell someone the full truth. 3 weeks of Emily checking in on her every day, sending texts, calling, making sure Ava knew she wasn't alone. 3 weeks of Ava wrestling with fear and shame, and the voice in her head that kept insisting no one would believe her, that she'd be blamed, that speaking up would only make things worse. But finally, on a Tuesday afternoon when Samuel was at work, Ava called the crisis hotline number Emily had given her. Her hands shook so badly she could barely dial. Her voice was barely a whisper when someone answered, but she said the words, "I need help. My uncle he's been hurting me, and I don't know how to stop it." The counselor on the other end of the line was calm, professional, compassionate. She asked questions, gentle but direct, and Ava answered them, her voice breaking, tears streaming down her face, but she answered them. The counselor explained her options. She could report it to the police. She could go to a shelter. She could get a protective order. None of it sounded easy. All of it sounded terrifying. But staying was more terrifying. Staying meant more nights of hearing those footsteps, more mornings of waking up and wishing she hadn't, more days of slowly disappearing until there was nothing left of the person she used to be. Ava chose to report it. She met with a detective at the police station, Emily by her side, and she told her story. Every horrible detail, every time it had happened, every threat Samuel had made, every reason she'd been too afraid to speak up sooner. The detective listened, took notes, and when Ava finished, when she was exhausted and shaking and certain she'd made a terrible mistake, the detective looked at her and said, "You were very brave to come here today. What happened to you was not your fault, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure you're safe." Samuel was arrested that evening when he came home from work. Ava wasn't there. She was at Emily's apartment, sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the wall, trying to process the fact that she'd actually done it. She'd spoken up. She'd told the truth. And the world hadn't ended. Samuel was in custody. She was safe. For the first time in months, she was safe. But Samuel didn't stay silent. He denied everything, loudly, vehemently, with the same charm and conviction he'd used to fool everyone for so long. "This is insane," he told the police. "I took her in when she had no one. I gave her a home. I treated her like my own daughter. And this is how she repays me? With lies. She's been unstable since her parents died. She needs help. Not this." He had friends who vouched for him, neighbors who swore he was a good man, co-workers who couldn't believe he'd be capable of such things. And for a while, Ava was terrified that he'd win. That everyone would believe him and she'd be painted as a liar, a troubled girl making up stories for attention. But then the evidence came out. Ava's journal, which she'd turned over to the police. Medical records showing injuries consistent with her claims. Text messages from Samuel that, when read in context, showed a pattern of control and manipulation. And most damning of all, a recorded phone call from jail where Samuel had tried to convince Ava to recant her statement, his tone shifting from pleading to threatening in a matter of seconds. "You're ruining my life," he'd hissed. "After everything I did for you, you're going to regret this." That recording destroyed any credibility he had left. The trial took 8 months. 8 months of Ava having to relive the worst moments of her life in front of strangers. 8 months of defense attorneys trying to discredit her, to paint her as vindictive, unstable, dishonest. 8 months of Samuel sitting across the courtroom, staring at her with cold, hateful eyes, as if he could intimidate her into silence even now. But Ava didn't break. She told her truth. She stood firm. And when the jury came back with a guilty verdict, when the judge sentenced Samuel Mitchell to 15 years in prison, Ava felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt free. Justice doesn't always move quickly. Sometimes it moves painfully slow, dragging survivors through months or years of legal battles, forcing them to recount their trauma over and over again. But speaking up is the first act of freedom. It's the moment you take back your power, your voice, your right to say, "This happened to me, and it was wrong." And no matter how long the journey to justice takes, that moment, that choice to speak, is where healing truly begins. The first few months after Samuel's conviction were the hardest. Ava moved into a small apartment, her first place of her own, and while she should have felt relieved, free, safe, mostly what she felt was empty. The abuse had stopped, but the damage it had caused was still there, buried deep inside her, affecting everything she did, every relationship she tried to build, every moment she tried to live normally. She struggled with trust. She couldn't be alone with men without feeling panic rise in her chest. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced she'd heard footsteps in the hallway. She'd go days without eating, or she'd eat compulsively, trying to fill the void inside her with food because nothing else seemed to work. Emily convinced her to start therapy. "You've been through something traumatic," Emily said gently. "No one expects you to just bounce back from that. You need help processing it. Real help." Ava resisted at first. The idea of sitting in a room with a stranger, talking about the worst moments of her life, felt impossible. But Emily was persistent, and eventually Ava agreed to try. Just once. Just to see. Her therapist's name was Dr. Rebecca Hall, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm, steady presence. She didn't push Ava to talk before she was ready. She didn't judge. She didn't tell Ava she should be over it by now, or that she needed to forgive and move on. She just listened. And slowly, over weeks and then months, Ava started to open up. She talked about her parents, about the grief that had made her so vulnerable, about Samuel, about the abuse, about the shame that still clung to her like a second skin, about the anger she felt, not just at Samuel but at herself, for not speaking up sooner, for not fighting back, for being weak. "You weren't weak," Dr. Hall said firmly. "Survival is not weakness. You did what you had to do to stay alive in an impossible situation. And now, you're doing the hardest thing of all. You're facing what happened. You're working to heal. That takes more strength than most people will ever have to find in their entire lives." Those words broke something open in Ava. She cried harder than she'd cried since her parents died, huge, racking sobs that felt like they were tearing her apart. But when it was over, when she'd finally cried herself empty, she felt lighter. Not healed, not whole, but lighter. Healing is not a straight line. It's messy, complicated, full of setbacks and moments where you feel like you're right back where you started. Ava had good days and bad days. Days where she felt strong, capable, optimistic about the future. And days where she could barely get out of bed, where the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her so hard she could barely breathe. But she kept going. She went to therapy every week. She reconnected with old friends. She started taking classes at the community college, studying psychology, drawn to the idea of understanding trauma, of maybe one day helping other people who'd been through what she'd been through. She learned about the signs of grooming, the way abusers manipulate their victims. She learned about trauma bonding, the psychological phenomenon that makes victims feel attached to their abusers even when they're being hurt. She learned about the shame cycle, the way survivors often blame themselves for their abuse, convinced that they must have done something to cause it, to deserve it. And the more she learned, the more she understood that what happened to her wasn't unique. It happened to thousands of people. Tens of thousands, maybe more. People who stayed silent because they were afraid, because they were ashamed, because they thought no one would believe them. Ava started attending a support group for survivors of sexual abuse. Sitting in a circle with 10 other people, listening to their stories, she realized for the first time that she wasn't alone, that her experience, as horrible as it was, wasn't some isolated tragedy that marked her as broken or damaged beyond repair. It was part of a larger pattern, a systemic problem, and understanding that helped her see her own story in a new light. She wasn't a victim of some random misfortune. She was a survivor of abuse, and being a survivor meant she'd already won the most important battle. She'd survived. Dr. Hall taught her coping mechanisms, breathing exercises for when the panic set in, grounding techniques for when the flashbacks came, ways to talk to herself with compassion instead of cruelty. "You're going to have moments where you feel like you're back in that house," Dr. Hall explained. "Your body remembers the trauma, even when your mind is trying to move past it. But you can remind yourself that you're safe now, that what happened is in the past. that you have control over your life in ways you didn't before. It sounded simple, almost too simple, but Ava practiced, and over time, it started to work. She also learned about the importance of boundaries. For so long, Ava had believed that saying no made her difficult, ungrateful, selfish. Samuel had taught her that. He'd trained her to prioritize his needs, his wants, his comfort over her own. But Dr. Hall helped her understand that boundaries weren't selfish. They were necessary. They were how you protected yourself, how you let people know what was and wasn't acceptable, how you built relationships based on respect instead of control.